He felt the change in the atmosphere immediately. The corridor didn't look different from the one he'd been in seconds earlier, but it felt completely foreign, even alien. The best word he could think of to describe it was charged. The very air seemed abuzz with an energy he'd never felt before, and it both perturbed and thrilled him. He felt he had brushed up against some veil, or a membrane that previously denied him entry, not as a trespasser, but as a human. A bizarre token waited in this room. It glittered in the dark like a sapphire. He felt it shiver and pulse in his hand, as though it contained some pressurized force that screamed for release. This parchment, ragged and soiled with blood, showed symbols very similar to those in the blue book he'd found earlier. In simply looking on them, he felt a peculiar thread of connection extend to his eyes and into his mind. In it, he felt an initial worry, but also a great potential. Behind this door waited an unexpected horror. A bloated insect, long as a man, turned on its 6 legs to face him. The thing chittered and hissed through its mandibles and heaved its back as though prepared to spit something at him. Obeying some unknown reflex, he lifted the scroll he'd collected and shouted the first word that entered his mind, though he knew not what it meant. Good Lord! On calling the word, the energy from the air around him seemed to gather into his very being and become a ball of crackling power. Like some natural conduit, he allowed the force to flow out through his arm and express itself as a shining white bolt of lightning. The celestial beam struck the insect in its head and reduced its hairy, chitinous form to cinders. Here was another strange trinket, not unlike the one he'd taken before. Its color was bone white instead of blue, however, and it pulsed and shook in his hand with an eerie vigor. He wondered if the two objects shared a similar purpose. The box drew his attention, but as he stepped toward it, something felt wrong. There was a presence, a strange disturbance in the atmosphere on his right. It felt as though something was tugging on the very air itself, trying to steal it from him. He couldn't abide this. He pivoted quickly and held the mysterious trinket out in front of him, just as he had done with the strange scroll. It was a dwarf, not one of the little people that was occasionally birthed in the village, but a creature that dwelled below ground. Magic-wielding, ugly, wrinkled things that guarded their treasures fiercely. He'd seen one and slain one, and with an object carrying the fury of the skies. He was amazed and horrified at himself. In all his years of conscription, he'd only heard rumors of the deadly powers of magic from the pikemen in his company.
Be wary, lads. Last night, we saw lights coming from the Wilmer camp. Purple flashes like lightning. The sergeant thinks that the enemy's got something unnatural in its armaments.
Dear God. Magic? They found a way to harness it on the battlefield?
Heaven only knows, but if they do, well, you'd do better to protect yourself with prayers instead of these spears, mate.
The confluence of this information was all too confusing. Our man wondered if this fated fortress was some kind of nexus, a point of historical value, not only for the sad war he'd seen, but for the world itself. A ring awaited him here. All folk in Dretel knew that gems embedded in silver had terrific defensive powers against the evils of magic. He had to take this up. He slipped it on. But on his right hand, of course. He couldn't risk insulting any hypothetical romantic partners. God was always watching. To his great surprise, he found a quiver of arrows here. He knew that he couldn't go on hurling his weaponry forever. He'd need an archer's ammunition to survive this quest. He gathered the arrows with all haste. He thanked God that his food supplies were healthy. Dry and old as they were, the rations and hardtack did their job in keeping his strength up. He would partake after his battles and find his energy not only renewed but improved. Once again, the premonition of danger struck. Perhaps it was some quality of the chamber he stood in. Through some unknown sense, he felt a threat here, to his right, that needed extermination. Another dwarf disintegrated. He found the incredible power of magic intoxicating, and he wondered why Dretel's militia had forbidden it. A helmet, bronze, dirty and dented, rested here. He brushed it off and shook it. A pair of slithering centipedes fell out of it and scurried away. Then, with some effort, he shoved it onto his skull, hoping there were no eggs in it. He began to take pride in the suit he was building. This object, which our man figured was another magical weapon, had a peculiar swirling shape. It was warm and percolated in his hand. He was anxious to discover what power it withheld. Again, that bizarre sensation approached him. He likened it to the disturbance a sleeper feels when there is movement in the bed covers. The magic of the air was being shared, pulled from him, and he could sense precisely where it was coming from. He decided to arm himself with the spiral object and put it to a test. Fire! The magical token had contained the primordial plasma itself. The dwarf hadn't stood a chance. Its unpleasant form was now a smoldering pile of ashes. Our man was astounded at the power he had come to command. A new confidence rose in him like the dawn. He began to believe that he might just make it. He might reach the bottom of this labyrinth, glimpse the edges of hell, and slay the Minotaur in its lair. Perhaps also he would save the village of Dretel from the pernicious forces that were, even now, working to reclaim it from its conquerors.